Hello. Welcome everybody. My name is Trevor Carroll. I'm the CEO of Disability Justice Australia, and I'm a member of the Victorian Disability Advocacy Network, which has organised this event this afternoon. And if you've got a conference program, you can find out a bit more about me in the bio on page 14 of the program, but I won't go into that. But first I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and also to the emerging members of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on behalf of the Victorian Disability Advocacy Network. Some housekeeping issues. The bathrooms are out that door and to the left and to the left. There's 3 fully accessible bathrooms. They're not gender specific, so you can help yourself to either any 3 of those. In the event of an emergency evacuation, you'll hear an alarm go off. Follow the instructions of the staff, but wait for me. Don't go without me. Okay. Now, your MC for the rest of the forum after we've had a keynote address is Eva Siffers. Now, Eva is here. Eva is going to take over after Bruce is finished. But there's a few things I'd just like to draw your attention to. First of all, on behalf of VicDAN, I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of the Disability Services Commissioner here in Victoria, who sponsored part of this event and facilitated Eva's participation as the moderator for the rest of the program, which is fantastic. It's really good to have Eva here, and she'll tell you a bit more about herself as well. So now I'd like to welcome all of you here for coming this afternoon. It's a very interesting topic that we've got here, which is all about defending participant rights and navigating the NDIS. And for those of you who are members of VicDAN, you'll know that all of us have an interest in the appeals process for NDIS. And this over the course of the last 12 months in particular, we've had a big focus on, well, where does the NDIS and the way it's implemented actually intersect with human rights? Because if any of you in the business will know that some of the decisions that we get from the agency from time to time don't seem to take into account human rights. And I thought it might be interesting just to let you know that the NDIS Act actually underpins the NDIS Act is underpinned by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and Article 1 sums it up pretty well, because it says under the UNCRPD, Article 1 is the purpose of the present convention is to promote, protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote and respect for the inherent dignity. Now, those of us in the appeals business know that many of the decisions don't even mention human rights, and certainly some of the lack of decisions cause many of our participants to actually have their human rights breached over a period of time. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to have this forum, because we had this fundamental clash of issues between the NDIS Act and the way it's delivered and the fundamental rights of people with disabilities under the UN Convention, which is cited in the first section, part 3, the objects of the Act. That the whole thing, the NDIS Act, is underpinned by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Is it? Does it actually work? Does the UNCRPD really influence the way the NDIS Act is delivered and services delivered, decisions are made by the agency on behalf of participants? Does it? Interesting question. So now, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Now, Bruce and I go back a few years. First time I heard Bruce speak, I'd known Bruce for a few years before this, but the first time I heard Bruce speak was here on the 27th of March 2014. And that was at a Community Housing Association of Australia forum. I think it was in Sydney, from memory. And this is what Bruce said at the time, when I think, Bruce, you would have been probably in your 4th year as chair or 3rd year as chairperson of the NDIA board. This is what Bruce said, that the NDIS is a flagship of reform for our generation. It's as much an economic reform as a social reform, and the Product Commission concluded the benefits will outweigh the cost and the NDIS will add 1% to GDP. It's a core government business. It's an exemplar of governments doing what people cannot do themselves and holds the key to disability spending being fiscally affordable. The start of the NDIS was remarkably smooth for such a large and complex reform. As at 31st of December 2013, there were 2,586 participants with approved plans. On the 1st of July, new trials will commence in the ACT, WA and NT, and the sustainability of the NDIS is the board's highest priority. That's what Bruce said back then as chairperson of the board of the NDIA. Things have changed because obviously we've had all the trials and now we've moved out right across Australia. We've just about rolled out the NDIS. So Bruce is going to talk to you today about two aspects of the NDIS. One of them is just reflecting on where we were talking about at the Community Housing Forum back in 2014. Where are we now? And Bruce is an expert at this. Bruce knows all about it. Bruce, if you've looked at the conference program, you'll see under Bruce's bio that he's regarded as the father of the NDIS. In fact, without Bruce, we wouldn't have the NDIS because of his fantastic advocacy over many years to try and get this system up. So Bruce is going to reflect on where are we now, that's the first part of his talk, and where are we likely to be in the next 12 months. So without any further ado, I'd like you to welcome Bruce and let's hear what he's got to say. Thank you. That's your big, yep. Thanks very
much. Trevor, thank you very much for that very warm and generous welcome. It's always great to see you again and to today have the opportunity to share the stage with you. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The theme of my talk today is about how we shift from quantity, bringing people into the NDIS, to a new phase where both quantity and quality become the key focus of the scheme. We've come a long way since early 2014, but we still have a long way to go. I always thought that this was at least a 10-year project, and in that respect, I certainly have not been disappointed. We remain in the midst of what is a very large and complex reform, and so I think it's useful today to take stock of where we are, look at some of the key challenges, and then also look at what some key actions could be as we chart the course ahead. We are in a quite unique position because for the first time, we have a Prime Minister with a lived experience of disability who immediately after the election identified the NDIS as one of his top 3 priorities for this term of government, who's appointed one of his key and closest colleagues as the Minister for the NDIS, and the government has now announced a review which will result in a service guarantee, which will report by the end of this financial year. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank you deeply for what you do on behalf of very vulnerable people with disability who need support, who could not get access to the NDIS and other essential supports without your advocacy, without your determination, without your commitment, and without your resilience. Over the past couple of years since I have been no longer on the board of the NDIA, I have found myself in the position of being an individual advocate on behalf of people seeking either entry into the scheme or advice on how to navigate the scheme. So as a result of those experiences, I now have some insight into the work that you do every day as individual advocates. I've been an advocate for systemic reform for a long time, but coming face to face with those individual issues I have found extremely grounding, and it's informed some of the things that I intend to talk about today. So let me just begin with some key statistics which I think help to paint a picture of where we now are and where we then need to go. So as at the end of June, there were just under 300,000 participants in the NDIS, and as we know from subsequent announcements from the government, we're now moved to more than 300,000 people in the scheme. The scheme is now available to Australians in every corner of the country except for the Christmas and Cook Islands. 5.7% of the participants in the scheme are Indigenous. It's almost a 100% increase from a year ago, and that compares with about 2.8% of the population. We always anticipated that there would be more Indigenous participants in the scheme than their representation in the population as a whole because of the higher rates of disability amongst First Australians. There's some debate, though, as to whether 5.7% is the right number, or in fact whether the number might and should be in excess of 10%. 8.4% of the participants identify themselves as being from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, compared with 27% of the population, so clearly much lower than we would have expected. And about 8.8% of the participants have a psychosocial disability, compared with the forecast from the Productivity Commission of 15%. And the reason that I've focused on these groups are these are some of the people that are having the greatest challenges entering the scheme, navigating the scheme and utilising their packages. 22% of participants are in paid employment, little change from the beginning of the scheme, but perhaps that's not a surprise when you think about all the barriers that people with disability face when they enter and try and stay in the workforce. The official figures suggest a participant satisfaction of 90%, but within that there are clearly many people who are struggling to get from the scheme what they need to get. Plan utilisation since the inception of the scheme is at 66%. This has been one of the great conundrums of the scheme since its inception. Why is it that people receive much more funding than they're actually spending? Is this a reflection of a lack of supply? And to some extent, there are signs that that's the case. Is it that they're having trouble actually implementing their plans because they don't have support coordination? And again, there are some indications that that is contributing to it. But we really know very little about plan utilisation, and so I will say some more about that later on. And the final point that I just want to note is that since the beginning of the scheme, there have been just over 2,200 AAT cases. 657 remain open, 1,576 are closed, with 1,522 resolved before the hearing and just 54 going to hearing. I know there is great concern about the level of AAT appeals, but at just 0.4%, I should mention to you that before we started the scheme, we thought that the rate of appeals would be 5%, so more than 10 times the rate that was in fact applied, and that was drawn from the rates of appeal that apply in accident compensation schemes. So in that sense, we're doing better than might have been expected. But overall, sorry, I just need to do that. Okay, sorry, I need to go back one. No. Okay, but within those overall macro pictures, those statistics, there are a number of key challenges that I think confront the NDIS and I think need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. The first issue is that while for many people this scheme is enabling them to do things that they've never been able to do before, for others this scheme is hugely complex. Complex to navigate, complex to use, and if you are Indigenous or from a CALD background or have a psychosocial disability or have a low level of education, this is a very, very difficult scheme to navigate. The postcode lottery of the old system has been replaced with a new lottery, the lottery of luck. The good luck of being or having access to an effective and well-resourced advocate, people like you. But not everybody can access an advocate. And this is undermining one of the key principles of the scheme, which is equity, fairness, and support based on need. We therefore need a much greater commitment to systemic, family, and individual advocacy, and much more support coordination in plans. Second, for those not eligible for the NDIS, there are even greater challenges, as the NDIS is an oasis in the desert, and currently continuity of support arrangements are masking the full effects of these problems. This is a major issue, which will only get worse under current policy settings in terms of fairness, and it also risks the sustainability of the NDIS. The Productivity Commission in January released a blueprint on how a new national disability agreement should be introduced to address this issue. And it's essential, in my view, that this is introduced early next year on schedule. The third issue is that we need a much better and shared understanding of the true meaning of sustainability. And Trevor referred to this in his opening remarks when he drew made a reference to the UN Convention and also to sustainability. In my view, the terms of sustainability and insurance principles have become heavily distorted, and we need to go back to what they really mean. Fourth, the focus of the NDIS has become much too individualistic. We need to do much more to build inclusion and social capital, including nurturing and sustaining families and carers in their roles, and opening up greater employment opportunities so that the economic and social benefits of the NDIS are fully realised. Fifth, for local area coordinators, the priority has been getting people into the scheme. It's all been about quantity. There's still approximately 160,000 participants to come into the scheme, so the focus needs to continue to be on quantity. But many of those people, in fact most of those people, will not have been in one of the pre-existing state systems. So they're going to be much harder to find, much harder to build trust with, and much harder to bring into the scheme in order for it to be equitable. So we need to have a focus on quality as well as on quantity. The focus to date on quantity is understandable, because the NDIS will not be fair until everyone who needs to have access to it gains access. And if we hadn't taken the approach of trying to bring people in as quickly as possible, there would be many more thousands of Australians today with their windows pressed up on the glass trying to get into the scheme. But now that most people are in from those state systems, we now need to shift to a focus on quality as well as quantity. And as part of that, local area coordinators need to go back to what local area coordinators were originally intended to do, to engage in service navigation, to engage in service development, and to build a much more inclusive community where people with disabilities have access, much better access to mainstream services. Sixth, we need to gain a much better understanding of what is happening to key aspects of the NDIS and why. A key feature, which I've already mentioned, is the low level of utilisation of plans. And why is this occurring? The NDIA is running the scheme on the basis that plan utilisation will soon go to 100%. This is based on the fact that in accident compensation schemes, utilisation, in other words, the proportion of each plan that participants spend, is around 95%. They're then taking a conservative approach and adding a buffer of 5% and working on the basis of 100%. But since the beginning of the scheme, plan utilisation has never been above 75%. And so we need to understand why that is the case and what's likely to happen to it going forward. Seventh, for everyone involved in the NDIS, it's clear that there's insufficient access to data and not enough research evidence available to drive continuous improvement. This is a fast-changing environment, and if we're going to realise the ambition of the NDIS as being at the centre of the best disability system in the world, we need to get access to more data so that we can drive continuous improvement. And that is why we have set up the Melbourne Disability Institute. But above all at this time, I think what we need is unity across the disability sector, as we were before the NDIS was introduced. United in our determination to make the NDIS work, united in our understanding of current challenges, and united in our analysis of the underlying causes, and therefore what the government needs to do to get the NDIS working for everyone. We need an agreed vision and action plan to drive quality as well as quantity. And to that end, I'm going to suggest 10 points that I think we could all focus on and, in time, I hope, agree on. So that the first thing that we need is a new national disability agreement. The Productivity Commission in January recommended a new NDA to provide an umbrella over both the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the National Disability Strategy, to clarify the roles of governments and improve accountability mechanisms, especially for the National Disability Strategy and access to mainstream services. The National Disability Strategy is a worthy document, but unless the new NDS is backed by clear accountabilities, benchmarking, performance management and funding, as recommended by the Productivity Commission, it will be like the current National Disability Strategy, great on form and having very, very little impact. The second thing that we need is an equitable and strong foundation for the NDIS through what the Productivity Commission called Tier 2. Tier 2 is an essential foundation for the NDIS, and without it, both the equity and sustainability of the NDIS will be threatened. The NDIS today is, as I said, an oasis in the desert. The average NDIS participant receives $40,000 per annum. The average participant in Tier 2 receives $40 per annum. It's therefore no surprise that people, when faced with the choice of either not being in the NDIS or trying to go into the NDIS, are doing everything possible to get into the scheme. We can see the evidence of this most obviously in the area of early intervention. Early intervention services were always intended to be available to roughly twice as many children who would enter the scheme under the permanent and significant disability conditions. But if you're a parent of a child with a disability, even if they've done well through early intervention, and you're facing the prospect of getting virtually no support for your child, and on the other hand thousands of dollars of support, it's little surprise that most parents are trying to get their children into the scheme. There needs to be a slope at the end of the edge, at the edge of the NDIS, not a cliff, so that the last person who gets into the NDIS receives just a little bit more than the first person who misses out. If we don't get that slope, what we're going to find is that the agency will continue to build barriers to entry. They will make it more and more complex for people to get into the scheme. It will become more bureaucratic. And the impact of that will be felt mostly on those most in need, the most disadvantaged, those who cannot advocate for themselves. Those who've got access to a good advocate or can advocate for themselves will work their way through the maze. They will get in and they will thrive, but those unable to get in will miss out. We have a very recent demonstration of how this works in Western Australia before the NDIS, where their CAP process or centralised access process gave very good support to those who were in, but those that were out received very little. And over time, the Disability Services Commission in WA just built greater and greater barriers to entry in order to ensure the sustainability of the little bit of funding that they had. So the consequence of this is that Tier 2 is an essential foundation. We need much more resources going towards those people in Tier 2. Otherwise, the vision of the NDIS will become totally compromised. It must be strengthened both strategically and operationally, largely through a reallocation of NDIS resources. To date, about $200 million from the NDIS, or about 1%, goes to Tier 2 participants. That additional funding from the NDIA, plus additional funding from state and Commonwealth governments, is what is needed to ensure a sufficiently strong foundation for the NDIS and equity for all Australians with disability. Thirdly, we need a shared understanding and commitment to sustainability. Sustainability is a measure of good outcomes for people, reflected in what the NDIA has been calling an ordinary life, plus a good financial outcome in terms of budget impact. That was always the financial modelling that underpinned the NDIS, that we could cap spending on the NDIS at around 1% of GDP, excluding those people ageing in the scheme, and at the same time we could invest in people so that they could maximise their opportunities over their lifetime and minimise the costs of support to government over their lifetime. So the measure of sustainability that I like to use is this one of minimising lifetime costs and maximising lifetime opportunity, because it also aligns so closely with the UN CPRD. This contrasts with the old welfare system, which was focused on short-term budget outcomes, and we need to make sure that this is not the case with the way the NDIS is governed and managed. So we need to shift away from that short-term focus to a truly long-term focus. I sometimes hear people say that we need more of a rights approach. My response to this is that we need to ensure that the sustainability of the NDIS is properly managed and delivered in line with the definition that I've given, and in that sense aligned with the UN CPRD. And so that, I think, is something in the current environment that we need to see reaffirmed and emphasised. The fourth point is that we need a comprehensive workforce strategy. In the absence of that strategy, any participant service guarantee will be hollow. The NDIA now has over 11,000 staff. We need to make sure that they have enough staff, that they're better trained, and that we have less staff turnover. So that when we come back to talk to the NDIA, to talk to our planners, we actually meet the same person again. Saving on staff has, in my view, been a false economy, as it has added to plan reviews and has created asymmetries and inequity. The target of an administration cost for the NDIS of 7% is, in my view, unachievable. And the Productivity Commission in its report in 2017 argued, or 2017, argued that administrative costs would need to be 10%. We're turning to the disability sector. The disability sector is doubling. And so the workforce is going to increase from between 70 and 90,000 people on a full-time equivalent basis. With most people in the sector working half-time, the new workforce will be somewhere between 140 and 180,000 people. And as we know, the NDIS is expected to contribute to about 20% of the new jobs in Australia through this rollout phase. We need to invest much more in the training of disability support workers, in the training of local area coordinators, support coordinators, and allied health assistants. We also need strategies in very remote communities of Australia to build the workforce. The NDIS, in fact, represents a golden opportunity to create permanent jobs in those very remote communities as disability support workers, by extending out the services currently provided by Aboriginal community-controlled health and aged care organisations. Fifth, we need an effective agency IT system and e-market. This has been a problem that has bedeviled the NDIS since the new system was brought in on 1 July 2016. The system built by Centrelink has never worked, continues not to work properly, and so we need to have a system that enables participants and their families to see their plans before they are sent for approval and finalised. We need a system that enables simple plan reviews to be undertaken without a full plan review. We need to get rid of the needless paperwork which is clogging up the back offices of service providers. And we also need an ecosystem which enables an e-market to flourish, and so to enable really efficient transactions to take place in this market and for information to flow to participants and providers as they navigate this new marketplace. 6, we need effective market stewardship. One of the great benefits that came from referring the NDIS to the Productivity Commission in 2010 and 2011 was that they did an outstanding job in demonstrating the economic benefits of the NDIS, that it would add 1% to Australia's GDP. In my view, this forecast played an enormously significant role in gaining government support for the NDIS. But because the Productivity Commission has an unswerving faith in markets, they also effectively assumed that just by doubling demand, supply would follow and that participants would be able to navigate this new marketplace. As we now know, that is not the case. So we need to assign clear responsibilities going forward for market stewardship, which will facilitate the necessary structural adjustment amongst providers and build supply. Facilitate information provision so participants and their families become more discerning buyers based on value for money, and build the capacity of individuals to navigate the new marketplace. We also need to set minimum standards for transparency and regulation. I'm particularly struck that the Office of the Public Advocate in recent months has produced a report on some of the unconscionable clauses that now exist in disability service provider contracts. These should either not be allowed, so they should be banned by regulation, or if they must be allowed to continue, they must become transparent so that participants understand the obligations and risks that they are agreeing to when they sign these contracts. And finally, we need a market steward who'll take responsibility for developing markets where there currently is no or very little supply, and hence respond to thin markets. The seventh thing that we need local area coordination to go back to what it was always intended to be, and that is to engage with community, to help participants in the scheme navigate and find the services they need, so that not all those requirements fall on you as advocates. The principles that should underpin local area coordination, and which were present from the beginning of local area coordination in Western Australia from the mid-1980s, included the following points, which I think are worth repeating. Family, friends and personal networks are the foundations of a rich and valued life in the community. It's not just about getting a plan, it's actually about having a rich life with family and friends. Communities are the most important way of providing friendship, support and a meaningful life, and are enriched by the inclusion and participation of people with disability. And that formal services complement and support the efforts of families, carers and communities in achieving a good life for people with disability. The goals for local area coordinators included getting to know local individuals with disability and their families, determining their needs in conjunction with them, providing timely and accurate information, advocating for individual families, and facilitating self-advocacy, and assisting individuals and families to build informal support networks. When the NDIS was drafted, it was not expected that local area coordinators would be outsourced. As a result, we're in a situation today where local area coordinators, when they work with individual participants in the scheme, cannot approve their plans. In my view, we should be changing the NDIS Act to allow local area coordinators to not just sit with participants, but also to be delegates of the CEO, and so ensure that decisions are made locally, close to the people affected by those decisions. The eighth point is that we need much better support for families to build social capital and to simplify processes. Before the NDIS, 80% of support for people with disabilities was provided by families and 20% by government. With the NDIS, families still provide 60%. And so unless we nurture and support them in those roles, the scheme will not be able to deliver. It's also important that we nurture and support families in those roles because it leads to a much better quality life. We need to remove the needless red tape, which many families are now grappling with on behalf of loved ones with intellectual disability and autism, who comprise 70% of the scheme. And if we do that, we can then be confident that more carers will enter the workforce or able to work longer hours, which was always one of the key intentions of the scheme. Ninth, we need better access to data and more research. There are, in many ways, the data is one research are the missing links in the current agenda. Data is essential if we're going to analyse the NDIS and make sure it meets all its objectives. And we need a strong research agenda to go with it. I would also argue that we need much stronger advocacy and much more secure funding for advocacy. As we know, in the lead up to the NDIS, the advocacy sector argued that the NDIA should not provide the funding because of the obvious conflict of interest. I think we now need to move to a situation where the funding is provided jointly by the NDIA, by the Commonwealth and state governments and by the National Quality and Safeguards Commission. We also need to make sure that we harness the voices of the Commonwealth Ombudsman, the public advocates, the state disability commissioners in support of more funding for advocacy. They have told me many times that without your efforts, their work would be impossible. So as the system changes and as, for example, the Disability Services Commission here in Victoria winds back, we need to make sure that they argue for more funding for advocacy going forward. And I would also suggest that you need to link up with new allies like Robert Fitzgerald, who's just become the Disability and Aged Care Commissioner in New South Wales. So I'd just like to now finish by saying that we need strong, systemic and united advocacy to capitalise on the Prime Minister's personal commitment to the NDIS and to ensure that the Tune Review delivers recommendations that are going to actually go beyond a service guarantee to identify the key drivers that are going to be necessary in order for the NDIS to deliver on its promise. Today I've mentioned 10 key points: the need for a new National Disability Agreement, increased funding for Tier 2, a shared understanding and commitment to sustainability, a comprehensive workforce strategy for the NDIA and for the sector, a fit-for-purpose IT system and e-market to underpin the new marketplace, and clear accountabilities for market stewardship, local area coordinators going back to the role that they were always intended to do, to build relationships with participants and families, to build social capital and to build inclusion, to nurture and sustain families in their caring roles, to democratise disability data and build the evidence for the NDIS to achieve its vision through research. And lastly, but by no means least, adequate and sustainable funding for advocacy and a united approach to the Tune Review and the government so that the NDIS delivers on its vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Well, where do we start? That was an amazing presentation. I don't think you got through it so fast. It was incredible. I took some photos of those. So are we able to get a copy of those to distribute? Great, that's fantastic. It's really good. So all those who took notes will get benefit of this. Look, on behalf of VicDAN, Bruce, and all of the participants here today, I'd like to thank you very much for your contribution. As usual, you're a font and a wealth of information, and not only information but inspiration. Congratulations on your speech, and thank you very much for your contribution today.
Thank you, Trevor.
Let's have it.